Welcome to another episode of Philosophy and Critical Thinking. In this video, we are going to think about James Rachel's article, Ethics and the Bible, which is about a moral theory known as divine command theory. According to that moral theory, morally right actions are actions that are commanded by God, and morally wrong actions are those that are prohibited by God. So that's a moral theory that spans a lot of religious traditions. You don't have to be a member of any particular religious faith in order to believe that divine command theory is true. But of course, there are many different religious traditions, and so many different ideas about what the divine commands actually are. Rachel's doesn't take a stand in this paper on what the divine commands actually are. Rather, he simply is using the Bible as a kind of test case for divine command theory. Right? The only reason he's choosing the Bible is that James Rachel's was a professor in Alabama, so most of the religious students that he had happened to be Christian. Right? But you could, of course, write an article called Ethics in the Quran, for example, and the kind of structure of what he says in this paper could easily be applied to ethics in the Quran if you were to write such a paper. Right? So in other words, it's just kind of incidental that he's choosing the Bible. Some other holy book would serve equally well here. All right, so Rachel's begins by drawing a distinction between clear teachings and interpretations. His idea is that there are some passages in the Bible that have clear teachings, and then there are other passages that require interpretation to figure out what they mean. Right, so he has a bunch of examples that he gives for clear teachings. For one of them, he says, from the book of Leviticus 29, if anyone curses his father or mother, he must be put to death. He offers that as an example of a clear teaching. For an example of a passage that requires interpretation, he offers Jeremiah 1:4, which says, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you." And this passage often gets cited in the context of the abortion issue, so many people cite it as a reason for thinking that God prohibits humans from having abortions. Rachel's wants to argue that this is a mistaken interpretation that involves taking the passage out of context. Right? So he says that most theologians accept the idea that this passage is actually just one where God is apparently saying to Jeremiah that even before Jeremiah was born, God had chosen him to be a prophet. Rachel's argues that if God wanted us to not abort fetuses, there could be a very clear teaching, could have been a very clear teaching in Scripture, like, "But I say unto you, the child in its mother's womb, tiny and yet unformed, is precious unto God, and he who kills the child, even before it is born, commits murder." This passage doesn't occur anywhere in the Bible or any other holy book, and so Rachel's suggests that there is no clear teaching against abortion. What's his main point in drawing this distinction between clear teachings and interpretations? I suppose his point is that he is bringing to our attention the fact that individual people tend to be quite inconsistent in how they select passages from religious scripture. He wants to suggest that what people typically do is apply their own preconceived notions of right and wrong, and they impose their own preconceived notions onto the book and then look for passages that would confirm what they already think is true regarding right and wrong. So in other words, they would be guided by a kind of confirmation bias in their selection of which passages are true. All right, so that's all I want to say about Rachel's distinction between clear teachings and interpretations. Philosophically speaking, the more interesting part of the article has to do with what Rachel's identifies as the practical problem and the theoretical problem for divine command theory. So the practical problem is the problem that the Bible and other holy books also contain so many rules that are just impractical to follow in today's civilized society. For example, he suggests that there's a surprising number of rules about the daughters of priests. If a priest's daughter plays the whore, she shall be burned alive. Leviticus forbids eating fat. It forbids letting a woman into church until 42 days after giving birth. It apparently forbids seeing your uncle naked. Seeing your uncle naked, I guess, is also called an abomination. It says a beard must have square corners. It says we may purchase slaves from neighboring states. So you get the idea here. So that's the practical problem. It would be impractical to try to follow all of these rules. Right? So the theoretical problem that he addresses here is what historically has been known as Plato's Euthyphro dilemma, which is discussed in one of Plato's dialogues called the Euthyphro. And here's what the Euthyphro dilemma is. Right, so the Euthyphro dilemma asks, is a right action right because God commands it, or does God command it because it's right? Right, so what's the difference here? If a right action is right because God commands it, then you have the command first, and then the rightness follows from the command. So before any commands were made, nothing was really right or wrong. What does that mean? That means that the commands could have been anything at all. And so the commands are therefore arbitrary. There's no reasons to back up the commands, no reasons that explain why the commands are actually good. So anything at all could have been commanded by God, and it would have ended up being right if the divine commands determine what's right. In other words, God could have commanded us to rape, murder, or torture each other, and then those actions would be right. All right, this seems to not only make morality totally arbitrary, it seems totally mysterious how something could be right just because it's commanded by an authority figure. The alternative here is that maybe God commands right actions because they're right. So rather than having the commands first and then the moral rightness follow the commands, rather it's the other way around. There are reasons that explain why actions like rape, murder, or torture are wrong. And God can recognize those reasons and then issue commands in light of recognizing those reasons. Right? So maybe God first recognizes that certain things are good for us, other things are bad for us, and then issues commands and prohibitions in light of that recognition. All right, that's another way that morality could be. That's another possible relationship between divine commands and facts about what is morally right and wrong. All right, now, if that's the right picture here, though, notice that that means the divine commands don't determine what's right and wrong. There are facts that exist independently of the divine commands, prior to the divine commands, that explain what's right and what's wrong. All right, so according to this theoretical problem, it looks like either way, there seems to be a very serious challenge to divine command theory. All right, I should mention that this theoretical problem is not suggesting in any way that there is no God. It's not suggesting that there is no wisdom in religious holy books. It's not suggesting that God is not all good. None of that, right? The point is just to get us thinking deeply about where morality comes from. Is it possible that morality just comes from a set of divinely given commands? And so even someone who is a believer in God, even someone who happens to be very religious, would presumably be quite interested in this Euthyphro dilemma, this theoretical problem for divine command theory, given that it can isolate a potential source of morality for us and get us thinking very deeply about that source. Right? Sometimes it's helpful to think about some potential analogies here. All right, so take logical truths like all A is B and all B is C, then all A is C. Right? That's a logically valid argument there, argument structure. What makes that argument valid? Is it the fact that an authority figure says that it's valid? Well, no. Right? Or take a mathematical truth like 2 + 2 = 4. What makes it true? Is it the fact that an authority figure says, I hereby establish that 2 + 2 = 4? Or is there some other explanation of, how numbers are related to one another? Some other explanation of what preserves truth from premises to conclusion in the case of logical validity. Right? So, yeah, there aren't a whole lot of people who think that there's like a divine command theory that's true of logical truth or of mathematical truth. Why think morality is any different? Why think that in order for an action to be morally right or wrong, there would need to be an authority figure who says it is?